right, everyone. Well, as promised, we're just going to plow right ahead. You all have been asking great questions. As we said, part of this process is one of seeing the way things look on paper and then actually doing it in practice. And I think we all observe that sometimes when you then probably try to do it in practice, it's a different thing, because we start dealing less in the world of laws and statutes. We start less in the law of statutes and more in the realm of humans with all of our human idiosyncrasies. So I think that'll probably continue with this as well as we dig into the idea of ministry and how we think of ministry in the Episcopal Church. One thing that's really important to jump right out in the beginning, if you look in both our Book of Common Prayer and in the canons of the Church, we identify ministry as being a thing that all people are called to, not just ordained people. We colloquially tend to refer to ministry, I think, as being ordained ministers of the church. But if you follow in our Book of Common Prayer and here, we very clearly say all baptized people in their vows are called to ministry, which is to participate in the mission of God. And whether that is through God calling you as a vocation to be an ordained minister in the church, as a priest, or as a deacon, or as a bishop, or as a lay minister. As I'm looking out of the room, I've seen lots of lay ministers. I see people that have been involved in going out and feeding the hungry, and teaching others, and being a good example for others, volunteering on Sunday mornings to help out at church, either taking care of altar linens, or forming the prayers of the people, or even just coming to the formation and learning and growing together and asking questions is ministry, or participating in the mission of God. So I really like that right off the bat at Canon 1, it starts with all people, all baptized people are called to ministry, to participate in the mission of God in the church. And, yeah, Rachel.
I'll point out one thing within Canon 1 is that the person in the pew being the minister is exactly the same and equal level as the bishop, the Archbishop of Canterbury, and everybody else. They are all the same.
I'll say it when I was, we even made a point of it to that end. In the Book of Common Prayer, when it first listed the orders of ministry, it said bishops, priests, deacons, and then all members. And talking to Bob Pritchard about it, Episcopal archivist and historian in the church, and Bob Pritchard was the one that said it should be flipped. We should list it as the ministers of the church are all members, then bishops, priests, and deacons. So they took it from the bottom and put it at the top. That was deliberate. Yeah, Jack.
You know, Stephen, it's maybe a time I'd like to ask. In a discernment process, sometimes you have to consider, you certainly consider this, but then you have to consider what are the special ministry opportunities for various leaders. And how would you distinguish, say, the ministry of a priest? I mean, there are so many obvious ways, but what are the unique roles for a priest as opposed to, say, a deacon or a baptized member?
Sure, that's a great question. And some of that is here in this Title III, and I invite anybody, as you go through it, it talks about discernment for ministry of all people, and then there are specific sections that talk about for priests, for deacons, for bishops. Do you all remember, who here was in the room when Micah Jackson, the president of Bexley Seabridge Seminary, was here? A few folks. If you recall, for the folks who were here in the room, Micah Jackson spent some time talking about the discernment process and said, the process as it's made in the Episcopal Church is meant to be to help all people discern what they are called to do to participate in the mission of God. And that discernment might be, you gather a group of other members of the church with you, you pray together, you study together, and what you may determine is, I'm called to be a great vestry person as a lay leader in the church. Or I'm called to go and serve as a representative on the Peace and Justice Commission for the diocese, which is not necessarily an ordained position. Or maybe I am being called to be a priest in the church. And the idea should be that discernment is for all people, and this talks about a discernment process. No person shall be denied access to the discernment process. That it's for all. But you may remember what Micah said. Functionally, what we've kind of turned into is the discernment process has become just kind of shorthand for vetting people for the priesthood. And when somebody is going through the process of being ordained, potentially ordained a priest, we form a discernment committee of other members of the church, and they pray with that person and study with that person to determine, is this God calling you? Do we see a legitimate calling here? It doesn't mean you'll be successful at it. There's still more processes there we'll get into, but is this a legitimate sense of call to ordained ministry? And Micah even cautioned us a little bit to say, we've lost some of the greater sense of discernment. It should be for all of us to be able to gather and discern. Am I called to be a Sunday school teacher? Maybe that's what God's calling me to do. Am I being called to help participate in the meal ministry? Maybe that's what God is calling me to. But we don't really tend to form discernment groups for that, do we? We pretty much form discernment groups just to find out, is somebody called to ordained ministry in the church? And Micah didn't have any simple solutions for us, but he did point that out, that's shifted over the years, and maybe we ought to be giving some thought to that. And he even suggested that Bexley Seabury Seminary, part of what they're working at is creating more opportunities to form robust lay leadership in the church, which, as there are fewer and fewer ordained ministers in the church, we are going to need more and more strong, well-trained, well-formed, discerned lay ministers in the church.
Stephen?
Yes, and John, I haven't lost it. We will get to your question.
I didn't realize it was in another canon.
Yeah, no, we will get to it when we get there, because that's a great question. But Aaron, yeah.
Just a comment. When I was on the search committee for Dominic's position, obviously we had a purpose, right, which was to find the next dean. But one thing that I was surprised about, and that came out of that whole process, was I think all the search committee members went through sort of their own discernment. And to your point, I had really never been called to do that before, but within the context of like, what do each of us bring to this process? We really did spend a lot of time actually discerning sort of who we are in relation to St. James and in relation to the diocese, so that we could be better at discerning ultimately the people that we were calling for the process. And that was a surprise to me. And I found that to be very fulfilling.
Oh, good.
And it would be wonderful if we could come up with other opportunities for lay people to have some kind of experience like that.
Like we don't have a discernment process for people to discern, am I called to be on Cathedral chapter? Just
We have
as an example.
a search committee that asks them, and that's about it.
Right. But I hear you.
Discern.
This happens again and again, and I will say every discernment group I've seen formed, and some of you all I know have been on discernment groups. I hear it every time. I thought this was about discerning this person's vocation, and I was shocked to discover how much discernment I was doing on mine in that process. So I know there's something to that there, and I hear a little bit of we could all benefit from this. So I'm glad to hear that that's the way the search committee felt. Like, I think that means the search committee was doing it the right way. It should have felt like discernment for them too. And obviously, you picked a good guy. So, just for the time he was here. So, interestingly, there's some denominations out there that have a process that's a little more free form, that's a little bit more like a person gets up and said, I'm feeling called by God to be a preacher. And they go, okay, boom, you're a preacher. Start preaching next Sunday. And that's the process. They don't go to seminary. God has raised up this person. It's a different way of doing it. It's not necessarily a worse way of doing it, but it's different than how we do it. I went to seminary with some great individuals who are members of non-denominational Baptist polity churches that they felt called by God to be a pastor, and they said, next Sunday you're a pastor. And then they went to seminary while they were doing it so that they got better at it, which was kind of the reverse way that we do it, which is we have someone go to seminary and be formed for a long time, and then we ordain you a minister in the church. So what you'll see is there's a lot more structure here than some denominations, which is just a little more freeform. We have things like a commission on ministry that must be formed. Every diocese must have a commission on ministry that's made up of a group of people. Now, from diocese to diocese, they may be elected, they may be appointed by the bishop, there may be term limits, there may not be term limits, but there has to be a commission on ministry of some kind. And this group will be the one that ultimately, once in a discernment group, we raise somebody up and say, we hear a sense of call here. This person is aspiring to ordain ministry either as a deacon or a priest. We hear they're an aspirant. We hear this call. We feel like it's a legitimate call of some kind. We now hand them over to the Commission on Ministry and the bishop to be on this journey of figuring out, now how do we determine how you need to be formed to actually do that work? And so this Commission on Ministry it says, advise the bishop, make sure they're implementing all the rules of the canons. This is the group that says we're going to go down to the canons and make sure before you're ordained we've checked off all those boxes. Interestingly, the determination of present and future opportunities and needs for the ministry of all baptized persons. And not to be disparaging of Commission on Ministry, I've been on Commission on Ministry. All the meetings I ever went to in the Commission on Ministry, we never talked about greater opportunities for all baptized people. I think we need to work on that. So it's easy for me to say now that I'm not on the Commission on Ministry. But just as Micah Jackson said, there's work we need to do there a little bit. Design an ongoing process. So I was just talking with some people who were talking about how here in Chicago at one point there was a discernment weekend you would go on. If you thought you were called maybe to the priesthood, you went to a retreat weekend and you stayed overnight, and it was a whole weekend that was designed by the Commission on Ministry. My process is, I was told show up at the diocesan office at 9 a.m. and I spent a couple of hours there in a meeting and walked out with them saying, yeah, okay, we hear your call, you can move forward with the process. But interestingly, just an example, in my case, I went to my priest, I said, I think I'm feeling the call maybe to the priesthood. What do I do? And he said, you need to go to this information day designed by the Commission on Ministry, and it's a once-a-year process. And I called the diocese and I said, sign me up for information day, and they said, it was last weekend. You have to wait a year for the next one. And so I had to wait 51 weeks for the next day so that in 3 or 4 hours they could say, yeah, okay, you can move forward with the process.
Well, you're first on the list.
That was the, I'm just saying, that was the process they had there with the Commission on Ministry admit.
Sometimes it pays to be a Baptist.
Now, I will say, as upset as I was, as upset as I was in that time, to say I missed this thing by 4 days and now I have to wait for a year, I also look back and realize I really needed that extra year. There's a lot that I grew and learned in that extra year of time that, who knows, if I hadn't missed it by 4 days, I might have gone to that 3 or 4 hour thing and they might have said no. So, the process obviously worked. Okay, as it was supposed to work, I guess. But each commission in each diocese sets up how they do it, and it may be a weekend retreat with the bishop. It may be a meeting in an office building somewhere. It gets to be designed by the Commission on Ministry.
Does this diocese have PCOs, parish commission on vocations? Are you familiar with that?
I'm not familiar with that
That
term.
if I wanted to become a priest,
Okay.
I first have to have a group is formed at my parish, and they determine if you should move on. It's a several week process, several meetings, and it's discerned that if this person has the call to be moved on, to be sent to the bishop.
Yes, well, and we don't call it that, but we have discernment groups that you have to form in your parish before you even meet with the Commission on Ministry. And usually, most dioceses, I think the Commission on Ministry usually trains those people to do the discernment work. I've heard in some dioceses the Commission on Ministry doesn't train as much as others do.
It was sort of the priest's responsibility to train.
Interesting, it was the priest's responsibility. Interesting. Here, for another thing, here, for example, the committee needs to be made up of not just members of the parish, but outside members as well. That was not a thing for my process. I didn't have to have members from outside the community also be a part of my discernment process. Andrew.
Oh yeah, I was just gonna ask similar.
Oh, similar thing.
Yeah, just because, yeah, my experience, it's a year in the local parish.
Okay.
And then you might get invited to postural weekend.
So for postulant weekend, yeah. So if you move along in that process and that group approves you and says, yes, we hear a sense of call, you're invited to Megan just went through this process, so I assume you're up to date on it.
2 years ago, yeah.
A postulant weekend.
Previous bishop, but yeah.
Right. Well, and that's true. That's another good point. It's also based on bishop versus bishop. So Bishop Lee may have wanted to do it one way. Bishop Clark may come in and say, I have a different way. For example, I know here, currently in the diocese, for those of you who know Louisa McKelliston on the 4th floor, Bishop Clark has appointed Louisa McKelliston to be very involved in the process of designing the training and selection for discernment group members. In another diocese, the bishop may want to do that themselves and not appoint someone else to do it. I think in Bishop Clark's case, the diocese is large enough, it doesn't make sense for her to be doing that. It makes sense for her to have a person that's appointed to be that person who does that. And I do want to be mindful of making sure we get to everything. So discernment, I should say licensed ministry. So as we go along here, you'll see there's different kinds of licensed ministries. This is important because currently, as it's said in our church, you don't have to be an ordained priest to do a lot of leadership responsibilities in the church, but you usually have to be licensed in some way if you are going to do that. So, for example, when we send out our lay Eucharistic visitors to go out and pastor to people, visiting them in the hospital, bringing communion, being a pastoral arm of St. James in the name of St. James, they have to be licensed to do that. They have to be known to, in this case, technically, they have to be known to Lisa. It doesn't work for her. It doesn't work for people to be going out and being pastors in the community if Lisa doesn't know who they are or what they're doing. They have to be known to her. We usually have training that we expect, and every year they are supposed to be re-licensed. So every year there's a list that goes out of all of the licensed members of our community, and we go down the list and we say, yes, 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 nope, that person moved away. That person, nope, not anymore. Like, but this person, yes and yes, and we have these newly licensed people. Worship leaders, very common among parishes that don't have many clergy or don't have a full-time clergy person. You might have a licensed worship leader who may be coming and leading morning prayer on a Sunday when you don't have a priest. You may have licensed worship leaders who do services during the week, or who I've seen scenarios where the licensed worship leader will lead the liturgy of the word at the beginning of the service, and then step away at the communion part to have a priest come in and do that part. Maybe a visiting guest priest. Licensed preachers. We don't just let anybody get up and preach. If somebody is going to come and guest preach on one-time service, like say Matthew Berryman's coming and preaching today, for a one-off like this, we don't have to have him as a licensed preacher at St. James. But if we had a deal with Matthew where we said, Matt, you're going to come and you're going to preach the first Sunday of every month, that we would want to have him be a licensed preacher, which again would mean there'd be expectations. You've taken some preaching classes, you've been through a process that we know you're not going to say anything wildly heretical in the pulpit, and you have to get re-licensed. Again, very common in churches that don't have full-time clergy people, because You may have 3 or 4 members of your community who are on a rotation of being your regular lay preachers. Eucharistic ministers, again, this is, again, like pastoral leader, anybody who's going out and taking communion, or Eucharistic visitor, anyone who's going out and bringing communion, or Eucharistic minister would be those people who serve in the church, like our chalice bearers, are supposed to be licensed for that as well. So Randy and Charlie and everybody, you have a training. We have another one coming up in beginning of April. We have another one coming up where anybody who wants to be considered to be an acolyte or a chalice bearer or work in the altar guild, they have to be trained and formed for that, and we will license them. A catechist, you see all these roles. A catechist, right, would be a teacher in the church, somebody who specifically is preparing people for baptism or confirmation. So I think of like Dean Niedenthal and like Dean and George. We're going to be working with the youth this year on forming them for baptisms and confirmations. They have to be licensed to do that. They can't just be teaching whatever. They need to be known to the clergy. They need to be known to Lisa. Lisa needs to know what they're teaching and have approved of it. And we know Dean and George will do a good job. We know they'll be amazing. We don't have a problem licensing them. And then an evangelist, someone who presents the good news in such a way that people are led to receive. Now, can anybody be an evangelist? Absolutely. Like, anybody can go out and evangelize, right? Can anybody go out and be pastoral? Absolutely. Anybody can go out into the community and be a pastoral person. What this is referring to is if you are doing it in an official capacity as a leader at St. James Cathedral in the Diocese of Chicago, if you're going to be doing it, not just me being pastoral to mine, but like if I'm being sent by the church to be a pastoral presence to you, I need to be licensed by the church to do that. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. So it's interesting to see that's all very structured in here, as opposed to say, maybe in another denomination it might not be so structured. It might be called to be a catechist, boom, you're a catechist, right? No licensing required. Provisions respecting ordination. So, just generally speaking, you want to make sure we got lots of time for this. Who mentioned postulancy? I think, Andrew, maybe you mentioned postulancy. So these are all the funny words we have. After somebody has been aspiring for ordained ministry, and they go through that process, the discernment group says, yes, we hear your sense of call. We will commend you to the vestry and the commission on ministry and the bishop to say, we hear this person's sense of call, and we support them in this. It doesn't mean they're going to be ordained yet. It doesn't mean they're ready to be ordained yet. This was an important distinction for my discernment group. Just to tell you all, like in my case, when I was meeting with my discernment group, almost 20 years ago, meeting with my discernment group at first said, no, we don't hear a sense of call for that Stephen Balke. I know, surprising, right? No, we don't hear a sense of call for that Stephen Balke. Met with the rector and the head of the commission on ministry, and they said, we just feel like he doesn't have enough knowledge yet in liturgy and music and in church history and in the Holy Scriptures, and he doesn't know any Hebrew or Greek or any of this. And they said, aha, you're not determining is he ready to be ordained a priest right now. Clearly he's not ready to be ordained. You are just determining, do you hear a sense of call so that we can send him to be formed to be a priest? And they said, oh yeah, we hear that call for sure. Aha, all right. So, I
just want to say, look at me now.
Well, I will say, I was very lucky that I had people who would go to bat for me,
Yeah.
like my priest, like my head of commission on ministry, that said, aha, the discernment committee, you didn't really understand what we were asking you for. It's okay if Stephen's not fully formed and ready yet. We will do that part. We just want to hear, do you feel like he has a sense of call? And then, oh, yeah, for sure, absolutely a sense of call. Okay. So then they approved me to be what's called a postulant. And a postulant essentially just means that this is a person that the bishop has approved to be sent to seminary to be formed to be a priest. So once you're granted postulancy, in most dioceses, once you're granted postulancy, that's when you're allowed to apply to seminaries to take a program of study. Then we move on to what's called candidacy, another word, basically meaning this person is a candidate for ordination. Usually what that means is they've been to seminary, they may not be done with seminary yet, but they're well on their way, they've taken most of their classes. In many dioceses, it means they've passed what's called the general ordination exams. Not in every diocese, but a lot of dioceses use these exams. That's, I would say, not as rigorous as passing medical boards or something like that. I don't think it's that serious of a deal, or passing the bar probably. But it's equivalent. It's the idea of saying you have to demonstrate competency in these 7 areas. There's 7 areas. It's 3 days of exams. And then you have to meet before a governing board of chaplains that has to go over your responses and decide, are you adequately formed yet, or do you need more baking? Like, do you need to bake a little longer still? So lots of times they use that process of taking your classes, and if you pass your general ordination exams, the bishop may now make you a candidate for ordination. Importantly, do you remember when we were talking about the standing committee? Was it last week or the week before? We were talking about the standing committee being the people who, among other jobs, are the ones who are the ecclesiastical authority when there's a vacancy in the bishop. Right, that it's the standing committee that does all that work. So in the interim between Bishop Lee and Bishop Clark, the standing committee is in charge of the diocese. One of the other jobs the standing committee has is to approve people for candidacy. So this is important. I think, so just a note, unlike some denominations which may just have a bishop that may say, yeah, I like you. You're one of my faves, so I will approve you for candidacy. Or what can happen is to have a bishop say, yeah, I don't like you very much. You're not my type. I'm not going to approve you for candidacy. That's a lot of power and authority to vest in one person, and we do vest a lot of power and authority and seriousness in the bishop, as we should. But it's important to note they aren't doing that work alone. There's also a standing committee made up of priests and deacons and lay people in the diocese who are also a part of that process, to meet with the person, to interview them, to go over their your transcripts of your seminary education, to go over the examining chaplains and your GOE exams, your general ordination exams. And so the whole standing committee will vote, do we approve this person for candidacy, to be a candidate for ordination. So it's a little bit of it's kind of that embedded democratic process, again, at work in there. We keep slipping that democratic process in there. Did I see, we'll do Craig and then Aaron? Okay.
Just backing up a step, the discernment committee, becoming a postulate. I'm just curious, once the discernment committee has said yes, are you pretty much on your own to figure out where you go to seminary, how you pay for it?
Oh, yep, no, that's a great question. That's a great question.
Does the church have specific rules on that?
So you'll see, it talks about that there is a process where you must be made a postulant and then made a candidate, and but it's left from diocese to diocese and bishop to bishop how to implement that. So some bishops may say to you, I approve you to go to seminary, I'm sending you to this one. You'll go to the one where I send you. I, for example, I went to a diocese where I was told, here's the 4 I approve of. If you go to any of these 4, you're fine. If you want to apply to one of the other ones, talk to me first. Because I'm probably going to say no, but talk to me about it first. And then there was a list of, don't even apply. I will question you as a postulant if I hear you're even applying to that seminary, right? And then there's other bishops that may simply say, go wherever you want. It will really depend on bishop to bishop and diocese to diocese. Now, some dioceses I'm going to pick on the Diocese of Long Island, for example, just because I know it off the top of my head. The Bishop of Long Island, very involved, will tell you where you need to go to seminary, will tell you what score they expect you to get on your general ordination exams, where you will go after seminary, but they pay for the whole thing. They pay for you to go to seminary, they pay for your exams, they choose where you're going, and they expect a 5-year commitment. When you come back, you'll stay at least 5 years where I tell you to go, but partly because we're trying to form for clergy in our diocese, so they're very involved. I was in the Diocese of Indianapolis. The bishop knew there's probably not going to be a job for me to come back to after seminary, so she was a lot more hands-off and said, go to seminary, you got to pay your own way, I'm not paying for you to go, because there's not going to be a job for you to come back to. So once you go to seminary, like, you have my blessing, you can go, and then you're on your own to find a job after that. You are released, is what they call it. You were released to go find a job wherever it will be. So I was on the hook for my own tuition and finding my own job. Advantages and disadvantages either way. Like, it's nice to have the kind of freedom to say I get to go to the seminary I choose, and I get to go and find a job in the church that fits me. It also would have been really nice to have a bishop say, I'm going to pay for your seminary education, and I'm going to give you a guaranteed 5-year job somewhere. But it means I'm picking for you. So one's not necessarily better than the other. They have their advantages and disadvantages. I'm sorry, Aaron, did you still?
I was going to ask almost the exact same
Okay.
question, but I'll ask a follow-up in light of your answer, which is, is there a common curriculum across the Episcopal seminaries, or?
Yes.
Do they, and maybe a follow-up to that, do they each have their own sort of, I don't know, specialty or perspective that you would choose one over the other?
Yes. Good questions. And more than we're going to be able to just get into in just the snapshot here, but good questions. The very next section is the canons do say how you have to be formed. And Micah talked about this a little bit as well. You have to have, it'll say, they expect you to have life experience, and that will be considered as part of it. It's a different process for somebody who's gone out and they've been a lawyer or a doctor or a business owner for years and years and years, and now as a second career they're going into the priesthood, but they have a kind of a maturity and experience to have been out in the world is very different than somebody who's gone from high school to college to seminary, now they're a priest, and it's the first job they've ever had. Those are going to be kind of two different paths of formation. Again, not necessarily better or worse, but two different paths for sure. So they'll take life experience into account, culture into account. They may say, the bishop may say, you've grown up, you're a city boy, you've grown up in the city all your lives, you've never known life outside of a city, and most Episcopal churches are going to be small, rural or suburban maybe churches of 30, 40 people in them. It's going to be different than your experience where the only church you've ever known is St. James Cathedral. So I'm going to send you to a seminary that's going to prepare you for this experience you've never had. I've known a lot of folks that say, when I was in the Diocese of Texas would not send people to the seminary in Texas if you had only been a Texan your whole life. Because they said, we need you to go out and get experience of the world outside. And so they would send them out to New York or Virginia or Connecticut or something and say, you need some experience outside of Texas. So they wouldn't send people to the seminary in the state.
You have to look at Texas to understand what your
Yeah.
main problem that is.
So they do take those things into account. In addition to that, so it's very general, but they'll say, you have to be formed in Holy Scriptures. They don't say specifically, like, this is how many classes you need to take in Old Testament and New Testament, but they do say you have to be formed in Holy Scriptures. And that would be one of those exam areas when you're doing your GOEs to kind of see, are you sufficiently trained in that, or do you need to take more classes in Holy Scriptures? Theology. Again, they don't say you have to take patristic theology, systematic theology, constructive theology, liturgical theology. They just say you have to be formed in theology. And again, that's one of those subject areas that you have to prove competency in. Church traditions, so you have to take some classes in church history. This will be especially true if we'll have, say, somebody who's coming in as a Lutheran minister and they're being trained to be a priest in the Episcopal Church. They love the Episcopal Church. They'll be a great pastor. They'll be a great teacher. They'll be a great leader. But they just don't know the history of the Episcopal Church. They'll probably have to take more classes in learning the history of the Episcopal Church, particularly. Other areas, so we're looking actually right now at the diaconate, so being formed in the diaconate, to know what a deacon is and what a deacon does. What is the idea of the theology of the diaconate? I like this one. Human awareness and understanding. You have to demonstrate competency in human awareness and understanding. Now, how do you teach a class in that? I mean, we do teach classes that supposedly help with that, but you're not going to take a class that's Human Understanding 101 or 601 or whatever it is. It's a master's level class, right? Spiritual development and discipline. Practical training and experience. So what the canons do is the canons will say, these are the areas we expect you to be formed in, to be pastoral, to be spiritual, to have discipline, to be a good teacher, to know the history of the church, to know liturgy. As to the specifics, now, in my case, so this is just very general training. In my own diocese in particular, say, my bishop sat down with my college transcripts and had seen I was trained as a teacher. I was a high school teacher. She said, okay, you're good on like the teaching and education part. She did something she specifically said. For her, Hebrew was very important. She said, I don't care if you take Greek, but you must take Hebrew. It's not in the canons to say you have to take Hebrew, you can't take Greek. That was just the preferences of the local bishop implementing it and saying, that's part of what I see in a fully formed clergy person is an understanding in Hebrew. Not Greek, I don't know. I took Hebrew and I took Spanish, so I didn't take any classes in Greek. But then other people I know had to take a ton of classes in areas that I necessarily didn't have to take classes in. So it may depend on from bishop to bishop. Seminaries, this was very helpful for me. Whoop, where did it go? Here it is. That's what I'm trying to get to next. Seminary, for me, as it was described, is a lot like law schools in the sense that, and I was going to say, I know we've got some trained lawyers who went to law school here. It was described to me that law schools can be very regionally focused. Like, what I was told, for example, is you don't necessarily want to go to Harvard Law School if you're going to be practicing law in Texas. Maybe go to Baylor instead or something. That's how it was described to me. But is that not accurate at all? Not accurate. Okay, good to know that the person who told me that didn't know what they were talking about.
All major firms are Harvard Stanford. Yeah.
Well, and sure, Harvard Law School may be a bad example because Harvard Law School is probably one of those things that works anywhere you go. Maybe it works more the other way. I don't know. Maybe do you think it's fair to say if somebody is going up to New England, maybe they won't look as highly on a Baylor Law School degree, or even yeah. Same. Okay, there we go.
Okay, there is.
I was going to say it's so how it was described to me as far as seminaries go is it's less about the education you will receive in a lot of cases. You will probably receive a good education in any of the accredited Episcopal seminaries in the country. But there are just some sort of regional cultural things. I mean, in the Diocese of Chicago here, and the Diocese of Indianapolis, we used to send everybody to Bexley-Seabury. Or we used to send everybody to Seabury Western, which is the seminary here in Chicago. Everybody went to Seabury Western. You knew the people. You all went to the same seminary. You kind of, there was a collegiality to it. When you had the odd person here or there that went to seminary in California, they would come in and they had also received perfectly good seminary education, but weren't quite as steeped in the traditions of the region, kind of like a Midwestern region. They didn't have the connections with colleagues. They didn't know the people. They didn't know sort of like the local idiosyncrasies of the Episcopal Church in the Midwest. And so you'll hear a lot of that in terms of people saying whether or not I will send you to a Southern seminary or a New England seminary. I'm going to send you to Connecticut or New York or a seminary on the West Coast in California. It's interesting to see how much bishops, in my experience, when deciding where somebody could go, had less to do with the classes you will be taking and more the regional cultural influence, if that makes sense.
Who are the teachers?
And the teachers are usually are generally PhD professors in theology and church history and liturgy.
So not necessarily priests, other priests.
Some ordained, but some not. Some may have been ordained Episcopal priests. I took classes from ordained Lutheran. My great first Old Testament professor was a Mennonite. But, the Old Testament, she's not teaching me about Episcopal history. She's a Mennonite. She was teaching me about Old Testament history and was amazing. One of the best teachers I had. And had a PhD in Holy Scriptures from Princeton or something like that, I think. But she was Mennonite, right? My liturgy classes, like how to do worship, my music classes, things like that, were more likely to be taught by Episcopal clergy because they got Episcopal worship. And you may find there's a section in here that will say you can go to any seminary to get that sort of general formation. You can learn to be pastoral at Union Theological Seminary, even though it's not an Episcopal seminary. But what we will do is after you've got your degree at Union, we'll ask you to come to Bexley Seabury, the Episcopal seminary, for a year and take some classes in specific Episcopal stuff that you weren't getting at a non-Episcopal seminary. So we may have somebody that went to Duke Divinity, got a great education at Duke Divinity. We'll probably still have them take some classes in Episcopal church because they didn't get a lot of that at Duke necessarily. So.
Tick-tock, Mr. Balky.
Moving to that area.
Oh, yeah. Oh.
As we get ready to go, just saying, I think this is a good wrap-up point. This specifically, you notice they put it in bold here. Right Reverend blank, Bishop of blank, we, the standing committee of diocese, have been duly convened at this place and do testify the person desiring to be ordained, in this case the diaconate of the priesthood, has presented to us certificates required, including that they've met all of the requirements so they can check all the boxes: pastoral, church history, fully formed, great spiritual person, and we recommend this person for ordination, in witness whereof we have set our hands on this day, and they sign it. So once you've been approved by the bishop and the standing committee to be ordained, if you're being ordained a priest, currently in the church you get ordained a deacon first, what we call a transitional deacon, which is a person that is going to be a priest, but through the canons of our church has to be ordained a deacon first for 6 months, and then can be ordained a priest. That's different than some denominations, which will just make somebody a priest right out the gate, and they don't make you be ordained a deacon first. We could do an entire day on the transitional diaconate. I think that's mostly good. I only have probably maybe another minute here, probably more questions than we have time to get into, but certainly maybe send me questions. I'm happy to discuss with anybody. But I hope the point here, a couple of points I was trying to make is, one, on paper, the idea of being formed as a Christian and discerning a call to God, saying God is calling you to participate in God's mission in some way. Help me see what that is. In theory, is for everyone. And sometimes I think we need to, how can we as a church do a little bit more of that leaning into that being for everyone? There's rules about how somebody has to be formed, and it's a very democratic process on how somebody can be approved to be an ordained leader in the church. But that even within the canons, there's a lot of wiggle room from diocese to diocese and bishop to bishop. I think it's fair to say there were some dioceses I probably would not have been ordained a priest. I know that's true for some people, that they were ordained a priest because they were in this diocese, but in this diocese the bishop would not have approved them. So that is something to consider as well about how does this work with our canons on paper. Yes.
The ordination that was here, that took place here in December, was in the 21st.
Yes.
That was that was not to be deacon,
That was right. We had ordained some people as deacons in June,
okay.
and then 6 months later we ordained them as priests. Yeah. And they were ordained here because it's the cathedral, the bishops. Thank you, everybody. I hope that was very informative. Yes, and now